This week is Sefer Devarim opens. We open Sefer Devarim this week. What? Oh, should I mute everybody? I did the recording already. This week we open with Sefer Devarim. And before we start dealing with Sefer Devarim specifically, we have to review a question that we've asked a number of times, but which warrants review. And that is, why is it indeed that our Torah is divided up into 5 Sfarim altogether? And this is a question of incredible importance because the Devarim could have given us the Torah in one Sefer and instead gave it to us in 5 Sfarim. And it's not only that it's in 5 Sfarim because that's the way the printers print it, but it is in 5 Sfarim because graphically in the actual scroll itself that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote, they are divided up into 5 different Sfarim. And therefore, the question needs to be asked. Why did Hashem divide up the Torah into 5 different Sfarim? And those of you who have heard us discuss this in previous, I'm sure everybody or almost everybody here has heard us discuss this multiple times, but it's extremely important in terms of understanding it as an introduction to the Sefer Devarim. We pointed out that each Sefer marks a different mode of interaction between the Borei and the Nivra. And that is why each Sefer exists independently. Not independently, that's the wrong word. Why it is that each Sefer is a separate Sefer. For indeed, each Sefer represents an entirely different fashion in which the Borei interacts with the Nivra. And if you think about it logically, that makes perfect sense, since after all, the whole point of the Torah is how the Ratzon HaBorei should be transmitted over to Bnei Adam. The only thing that logically would be a sensible explanation for a different Sefer is if somehow or another that transmission took on a different form. And that is indeed why it is that each Sefer is different. Now, I'm not going to go through all the 5 Sfarim. We've done that in different Shiurim. But I am going to focus a little bit on Sefer Devarim. Because Sefer Devarim opens up with words that are already on their own problematic. Eila Hadvarim Asher Diber Moshe, these are the words that Moshe spoke. So the Gemara Megillah says, quoting Abaye says that Eila Hadvarim Asher Diber Moshe tells us that Moshe mipi atzman amra. That unlike all the other 4 Sfarim, this 5th Sefer, Moshe said mipi atzma. He said it on his own, so to speak. Which of course means that this was obviously a very different form of communication between the Borei and the Nivra. Which of course is why Sefer Devarim is its own Sefer, because it does indeed represent a different form of communication. And the question is, of course, what does Abaye mean when he says that this Sefer Moshe mipi atzmai omer, that this Sefer Moshe Rabbeinu himself, he said it on his own? So on the surface, you would say that what it means is that unlike the rest of the Torah, which was given to us by Hashem, Moshe Rabbeinu decided on these items on his own. But obviously that can't be so for 2 reasons. Reason number 1 is there are mitzvahs in this Sefer. There are a lot of mitzvahs in this Sefer. And a mitzvah can't be a mitzvah if Moshe said it mipi atzma. If he said it all on his own, then it wouldn't be classified as a mitzvah. The only thing that could ever be classified as a mitzvah, if it is indeed a statement that was made by Hashem himself, that Moshe Rabbeinu taught us the way he taught the rest of the Torah. And so if you find mitzvahs in Sefer Devarim, it can't be that Moshe said them on his own. That's number one. Number two, the Rambam in the Yesod Hadas, in the 8th Yesod, goes out of his way to make it very clear that there is no such thing as Moshe having said anything on his own. Listen to what the Rambam says in the 8th Yesod. That the Torah is min hashamayim. That is to say, v'hu, shena amin, ki kol ha-Torah hazois ha-nesuna al yedei Moshe Rabbeinu olav hashalom, that all of this Torah that was given to us by Moshe Rabbeinu, shehi kula mipi hagvura. It is all in its entirety from Hashem himself. Koloimar, that is to say, shehigia elav kula me'es Hashem yizborach, that it arrived into Moshe Rabbeinu's possession from Hashem himself, in whatever form, whatever word we're going to use to describe how it is exactly that Hashem communicated with Moshe Rabbeinu. And therefore, everything, without exception, came directly from the Borei himself. And on the basis of that, and further on in the Yesod, the Rambam writes as follows: Ve'ein hefresh bein uvnei Cham Kush u'Mitzrayim. There's absolutely no difference between the pasuk in the Torah that says, "And the children of Cham were Kush and Mitzrayim," or the other pasuk, V'shem ishtoi Mahatavel, and the name of his wife was Mahatavel, or the next pasuk that he quotes, V'timna hoisa pilegesh, our favorite, and Timna. There is absolutely no difference between any one of those psukim, ubein anoichi Hashem Elokecha u'shma Yisrael, and the psukim of anoichi Hashem Elokecha, which was Maimon Har Sinai, and the psukim, let's say, of Shema Yisrael. There's absolutely no difference. The pasuk that says Uvnei Cham Kushu Mitzrayim, the children of Cham were Kush and Mitzrayim, and the pasuk Anochi Hashem Elokecha are exactly the same. They all come mipi hagvura. Ki hakol mipi hagvura. All of it comes directly from Hashem, without any difference whatsoever. So much so that anyone who should deny this and say that there are some things that came from Moshe Rabbeinu himself is considered to be kafir in this Yesod, and one who is kafir in any one of the Yesod Sadas is classified as an apikaris. Now the pasuk of Shema Yisrael is in Sefer Devarim, and the Rambam is using that as one of his proofs. Right? He's not saying the pasuk of Shema Yisrael is no different than Anochi Hashem Elokecha. For some reason, that everybody takes for granted. Those for sure came from Hashem. He's saying the pasuk of Va'achoi Sloitan Timna and Shema Yisrael are both equally from Hashem himself. And Shema Yisrael is in Sefer Devarim. And so it's clear from the Rambam, both in terms of the example that he gives and also in terms of the whole Yesod itself, the high concept of the Yesod, that there is no such thing as Moshe Mipi Atzmai Amra. Cannot be. And therefore we have to wonder, so if this is a Yesod Hadas, that every single word of our Torah came to Moshe Rabbeinu in exactly the same fashion, in exactly the same way, and indeed there is no difference between Va'achoi Sloitan Timna and Anochi Hashem Elokecha, or Uvnei Cham Kush Mitzrayim and Shema Yisrael, what then does Abaye mean when he says that Moshe Mipi Atzmai Amra? What does he mean? Because it clearly can't mean what it sounds like it's saying, that Moshe said it on his own. Mipi Atzmai Amran, from his own mouth he said them. Can't mean that. It's just not possible. For both of the reasons that I said. A, it contradicts one of the Yesod Sadas, and no one, not even Abaye, can argue on the Rambam. That's obvious. And B, there are mitzvahs in the Sefer, which make it impossible, make it absolutely impossible for us to say that it came from any source other than Hashem himself. And so we have to figure out what then does the Gemara mean when it is saying that Eila Hadvarim Asher Diber Moshe means that Moshe said them all on his own. Now, this question isn't my own question. This question is, of course, a question that has been asked throughout all of the ages. And the Goyen also asks this question. And the Goyen gives an interesting answer. The Goyen says that, of course, this wasn't said by Moshe all on his own. That's not what Abaye means. However, what Abaye means is that this Sefer, the Nevuah that Moshe Rabbeinu received for this Sefer, was similar to the way all other Nevi'im received their Nevuah. All Nevi'im receive their Nevuah and then they go ahead and they share their Nevuah. But the Nevuah that they share is their understanding of the vision that they saw. And then they articulate that vision into the words that they articulated in, however they verbalize it. And unlike the other four Sfarim, where Moshe Rabbeinu was speaking a verbatim account of the whatever it is that Hashem had said to him, this Sefer is different in that he gave over the Nevuah similar to the way that all other Nevi'im give it over. That's the Goyen's answer. And that's what Abaye means. So of course it's been Nevuah. It's not Moshe Rabbeinu making it up on his own. Nonetheless, it's mipi atzmai in that he said it on his own as opposed to merely being a mouthpiece of the Beirei, a repeater, a verbatim repetition of the Lashon HaBeirei. Here, Moshe Rabbeinu said it or told it over or transmitted it in a way similar to all the other Nevi. The problem with this guy is that all he's managed to do is to deflect the question. The question was that Abaye, as we understand Abaye, is going against one of the Yesodei Hadas. All the Goyen has managed to do is to deflect it to a different Yesod of the Yesodei Hadas. Good, so now it did come from Hashem. Shkoyach. But it still is a problem. Why? Because the Rambam makes it very clear that the entire difference between that which is called Torah, actual Torah, and that which is not Torah, what we call Divrei Kabbalah, whether it is Nevi'im or whether it is other things, Divrei Kabbalah, the entire difference between them is that Moshe Rabbeinu did not receive a vision that he then articulated, but rather that Moshe Rabbeinu was able to repeat verbatim what it is that the Beirei had said. That is the fundamental difference between Divrei Kabbalah and what is classified as actual Torah. So now again, according to the Goyen, how could Sefer Devarim be considered part of Torah if it's true that Moshe Rabbeinu was saying it over in the same fashion that all other Nevi'im say their Nevuah? Then it's no longer Torah. Then it should be classified as something else. And yet, there are mitzvahs in this Sefer. And yet, it is considered part of Torah. And so, yes, the Goyen has managed to resolve Abaye from being a contradiction to the Yesod Hashmini of the Yesodei Hadas, but all he's done is he's just deflected the question elsewhere. Now we have a different problem. How could the Goyen's answer work if it goes against the definition of Torah, the way the Rambam explains the definition of Torah? So before we start with the answer, let's first understand what it is that the Goyen's even trying to say. Let's just make sure we have clarity into what it is that the Goyin is saying. Okay? There are three main differences between the Nevuah of Moshe Rabbeinu and all other Nevi'im. And it's these differences that make Torah the inviolate Torah that it is, as opposed to other Nevi'im, which are not considered to be Torah. These three differences, three main differences. And they are as follows. Number one, in order to be a Navi, one has to be able to achieve a certain state in which he is far more a consciousness than he is a physical entity. The way that Bilam describes it is perfect. Bilam says, Nofel ugelui einayim, which is to say that relative to the degree of nefila, relative to the degree of how much you relinquish of your own physical capabilities, the more we call collapse in terms of the physical capabilities, in direct proportion, direct correlation to how much a person is a neifel, you have an equal portion gelui einai. In equal portion, you have how much clarity he will have, the Navi will have, in terms of his nevuah. So that the definition of a Navi, the greater he is, and the nevuah that he receives, comes down to this simple formula as described by Bilam. Neifel ugelui einai. Relative to the nefila, that's the type of gilui einayim you have. Moshe Rabbeinu, however, was Ma'aseh Nisim. He wasn't a Navi who achieved nevuah through relinquishing his physicality so that he became far more consciousness than he was physical. Moshe Rabbeinu was an entirely different creature. Moshe Rabbeinu was a creature who was both 100% consciousness while being physical all at the same time. How is that possible? Indeed, it isn't, says the Ran, and it's based on this impossibility that the Torah is able to state with certainty that there will never be a Navi like Moshe again, because it is not something that can be achieved. Nevuah is something that can be achieved. A person could go ahead and dedicate his life to being able to achieve nevuah, what we call the b'nei hanevim. That doesn't mean he will have nevuah, but in order for one to even be susceptible to nevuah, to be open to nevuah, it is something that can be achieved through what it is that he dedicates himself to. So the more he dedicates his relinquishing of physicality and makes himself more pure consciousness, the more open he is to the possibilities of nevuah. Moshe Rabbeinu, though, was Ma'aseh Nisim. He was both 100% consciousness and physical simultaneously. And therefore, Moshe Rabbeinu never needed a nofel in order to achieve Gilui Einayim. That's fundamental difference number one. Number two is, for all other Nevi'im, the Nevuah would come in what the Navi describes as a chazain, or a mar'eh, a vision, or a sight, or the way the Torah puts it, b'chaloim adaber bay, what we translate as a dream. Masha'enkein Moshe Rabbeinu, he didn't receive it in the form of a vision that then needed to be articulated. He received it as is directly from the Bayer. The way that I'm talking to you, that's the way he would receive it from Hashem. What we call panim el panim, or pe el pe adaber bay. The way that we, you and I, chap shmuz, in exactly the same way, that's how Moshe Rabbeinu and Hashem would converse. So it didn't require articulation of a vision. Right? If you read the Nevi'im, you look at Yirmiyahu, you look at Yeshayahu, you look at Yecheskel, you wonder if they even spoke the same language. The differences in their expressions are so huge, you have to wonder, did they even speak the same language? How could it be that it all came from the same Beire? Either the Beire speaks Lashon HaKodesh or he speaks a different dialect of Lashon HaKodesh, but he can't speak multiple dialects of Lashon HaKodesh. How then could Yecheskel sound like he's speaking a different language than Yeshayahu? The answer is very simple. Yeshayahu and Yecheskel didn't receive the Nevuah as a conversation like you and I are having. They received it in a vision, which they then articulated in their own words. And that's why they sounded different. For each one spoke a different way. They had a different dialect or a different, whatever you want to call it, of Lashon HaKodesh. And that's how they come out, sounding so differently. Moshe Rabbeinu didn't have that. Moshe Rabbeinu didn't get a vision that he then had to put into words. Moshe Rabbeinu merely repeated a direct conversation, peh el peh, that he had with the Beire. And the third fundamental difference is that all other Nevi'im, they could prepare themselves for Nevuah, they could train themselves to the achievement of Nevuah, but that didn't mean that they would absolutely get Nevuah. And even if they would have Nevuah, it doesn't mean that they would have a second Nevuah or a third. Even Bilam, again, makes it very clear that he is totally dependent on Hashem's willingness to appear to him and to give him a Nevuah. And all Nevi'im are like that. They could make themselves available, they could put themselves into a state in which Nevuah becomes a possibility, but not a certainty. Moshe Rabbeinu, on the other hand, could have on-demand Nevuah. And this the Torah says in multiple places. For example, by Bnei Tzlavchad, where he says to them, wait one moment and I'll ask Hashem. Because Moshe Rabbeinu had on-call Nevuah. He could just say, I'll ask Hashem, and he would turn around and ask Hashem, and then he would turn back and he would have the answer. Those are the three main differences. I shouldn't even use the word main. Those are the three fundamental differences between all Nevi'im and the Nevuah of Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, in terms of understanding the Goyim, here's what the Goyim is holding. The Goyim understands that difference number one, that is to say, the need to relinquish physicality in order to become more consciousness, as opposed to Moshe Rabbeinu, who did not need that. And difference number two, that is to say, that he was able to repeat over a verbatim account of what Hashem had said to him, a panim el panim, as opposed to Nevi'im, who had to articulate a vision. The Goyim sees the two as really one. He doesn't see them as two. He sees them as one. In other words, what the Goyim is basically holding is the reason why Moshe Rabbeinu was able to repeat things peh el peh that he received, peh el peh, is because he did not need to relinquish himself. All the other Nevi'im were not able to receive Nevuah peh el peh because they needed to relinquish themselves. But Moshe Rabbeinu didn't. And therefore, in consequence, he was able to receive Nevuah peh el peh. That being understood, it now becomes clear what the Goyim meant in his attempt to explain what Abaye was saying when Abaye said that Moshe mipiatzmai. Here's what the Goyim is saying. The Goyim is saying as follows. All the other Nevi'im, they received the Nevuah. That's when they were in their state of Nevuah. And then when they would come out of their state of Nevuah, they would then figure out a way to articulate what they had seen in their Nevuah and share that with the people. Unlike Moshe Rabbeinu, he did not need to remove himself from the state of Nevuah that he was in order to be able to share. Because he was still totally physical while being total consciousness. Thus, he was able, in the same exact state that he had been in, to say over what it is that he had heard. Does everybody understand this difference, what the Goyin is saying? Memela says the Goyin, that's what we mean. Sefer Devarim, of course, was Moshe Rabbeinu. The way Moshe Rabbeinu was always Moshe Rabbeinu. Verbatim, peh el peh, the way it's always peh el peh. The difference between Sefer Devarim and all the other Sfarim is that unlike all the other Sfarim, where Moshe Rabbeinu would then share what he had heard, peh el peh, while in the state of that nevuah, for he was able to, Sefer Devarim is different. He repeated it over, peh el peh, that is to say, verbatim, an exact rendition of what it is that Hashem had said. Only in Sefer Devarim he did it when not in the state of the nevuah. That's what the Goyim means. So is it still Torah? Of course it's still Torah, because it is still peh el peh. And so it does not challenge the Rambam's definitive explanation of the difference between Divrei Torah and Divrei Kabbalah. It still is a verbatim account of that which he heard peh el peh. Nonetheless, it is different in that, unlike the rest of the Torah that Moshe Rabbeinu would say while still in the state of the Nevuah, when it came to Sefer Devarim, he would repeat what he had heard not in the state of Nevuah. That's the way the Goyin is understanding the difference between Sefer Devarim and all the other Sfarim, and that's the way the Goyin is understanding what it is that Abaye meant when he said that Moshe mipiatz me'om. Okay, at least now we understand it. So now we have a clear grip on what the Gemara means when it says Moshe mipiatz me'om. It doesn't have to challenge the Yisrael Hashmini. It doesn't have to challenge this definitive description of the differences between Divrei Torah and Divrei Kabbalah. We now understand what it is that the Gemara, what it is that Abaye wanted when he said that this Sefer, Eila Dvarim Asher Diber Moshe, is describing something that was said Moshe mipiatz. Wonderful. Of course, we have to ask ourselves the obvious question. Why? Why is it that we need a Sefer that Moshe Rabbeinu said mipiatzmei? I understand how it is now, what mipiatzmei means. I understand what the Goyin is saying. I hear what mipiatzmei actually means. I got it. But that doesn't tell me why. Why did Moshe Rabbeinu need to do that? There must be a reason why Moshe Rabbeinu wanted Sefer Devarim to be said over, why it is that the Beirei wanted Moshe Rabbeinu to say it over, while not in the state of Nevuah. There has to be a reason. And we have to understand why. What is it that Moshe Rabbeinu was accomplishing by giving us over Sefer Devarim in this fashion that Abaye calls mipiatzmei? And so I think that the key to understanding the why lies in the actual name of the Sefer. In the Lashon of our Chachamim, the name of this Sefer is Mishnah Torah. In our vernacular, the name of this Sefer is Sefer Devarim. Now, on the surface, the two seem like they're very different. Different titles, different names for the same Sefer. However, Rashi himself translates the words Mishneh HaTorah Hazos when Moshe Rabbeinu uses the word, because the Torah actually uses the word Mishneh Torah. When the Torah is talking about a melech, about a king, the Torah tells us that a king has an additional mitzvah, and that mitzvah is to write a second Sefer Torah, as learned from the words Mishneh HaTorah. Says Rashi on the words Mishneh HaTorah, Lashon Shinun V'Dibur. The words Mishneh Torah, that's an expression of Shinun, teaching over, confidence in the material, and Dibur, and speaking. That's what the word Mishneh HaTorah means. And so you see that calling it Devarim and calling it Mishnah Torah are really one and the same. For Mishnah Torah means Shinun, which is Mishnah, and Dibur, which is Devarim. And so the entire purpose of this Sefer is given away by its title. You know what the purpose of this Sefer is? It is meant to be a Shinun and a Dibur. That's what it's meant to be. And somehow or another, by having a Sefer that is both Shinun and Dibur, something is accomplished. And it is for that something that is gained by having a Shinun and Dibur Sefer that Moshe Rabbeinu said over the Nevuah that he had received from Hashem in the fashion described by Abaye Mipi Atzmai, as explained by the Goyim. That is to say, it was definitely repeated Peh Peh in the verbatim, just instead of repeating it while in the state of Nevuah, he repeated it like all other Nevi'im would when not in the state of Nevuah. And somehow or another, that allows for Shinun and Dibur, and it is Shinun and Dibur that Moshe Rabbeinu needs or wants and requires, that then would explain why it is that Sefer Devarim is so fundamentally different than the other four Sfar. And so we have to focus a little bit on understanding what is it exactly that Moshe Rabbeinu achieves through Shinun and Dibur. There's an interesting Gemara. The Gemara says like this. It's a Gemara in Brachas. The Gemara says like this. The Gemara asks, what's the definition of an Am Ha'aretz? And the Gemara gives this answer, that answer. And then the Gemara closes with, Acherim Oimrim, Acherim say, that the definition of an Am Ha'aretz is, Afilu Kara Vishana, even someone who has learned all of Torah. Vishana, he has also learned Torah Shebal Peh. V'lo Shimesh Talmidei Chachamim, but he didn't do Shimush Talmidei Chachamim, Harei Ze Am Ha'aretz. That's an Am Ha'aretz. Then the Gemara goes on and says, Omar Rav Huna, Halacha Kechachamim, Ka'acherim. The practical halacha follows the opinion of Acher, that the definition of an Am Ha'aretz is someone who has learned everything there is to learn. Kara v'shana, Torah shebiksav, Torah shebal peh. He's still an Am Ha'aretz. Why? Because he didn't do shimush talmidei chachamim. That is the halachic definition of an Am Ha'aretz. Lack of shimush talmidei chachamim, no matter how much you know, no matter how much you have learned, the lack of Shimush Talmidei Chachamim will forever classify you halachically as an Am Ha'aretz. That's what Rav Huna says. The halacha is like Acher. Now, you understand what this means? It means you have a person, he's learned, he knows everything. He learned all of Torah Shebiksav, all of Torah Shebal Peh. He knows it all. He's got it all at the tips of his fingers, for all you know. But he wasn't Mishamish Talmidei Chachamim. He's an Am Ha'aretz. Straight up, an Am Ha'aretz. No, it's not nice. Don't call him an Am Ha'aretz. Okay, it's not nice, but Rav Huna says that he's an Am Ha'aretz. What do you want me to do? Saying, he's an Am Ha'aretz. Case closed. Now, that's a scary thought if you think about it, because that means that being taught Torah, Torah Shebiksav, Torah Shebal Peh, doesn't guarantee the transmission of Torah. Because imagine, you have a guy, his Rebbe taught him everything there is to know, but he was not Mishamish Talmidei Chachamim. That means that Torah was not transmitted properly, because he's an Am Ha'aretz still. Now, you agree that transmission to an Am Ha'aretz or through an Am Ha'aretz is obviously not going to be the ideal transmission. So you have a person, he was Korah, he was Shana, all of the 9 yards, but he wasn't Mishamish Talmidei Chachamim. Doesn't matter. That's a flawed transmission because he's missing Shimush Talmidei Chachamim. That's a very scary thought. What makes it even scarier is that Klal Yisrael received the Torah from Hashem himself. Moshe Rabbeinu gave it to them as he received it, peh el peh. You're not going to find a crowd who has fulfilled the requirements of Korah V'Shana more than that generation who actually received the Torah. But when were they Mishamish Talmidei Chachamim? So sure, the Torah tells us about Yehoshua, that Yehoshua nar lo yomush mitoicha oyel. So Yehoshua was Mishamish Talmidei Chachamim. But Klal Yisrael as a whole, when did they ever have the opportunity to be Mishamish Talmidei Chachamim? Are we to think, are we to imagine that the very Dor HaMidbar who received the Torah, who are the ultimate key to the transmission of that Torah, are all Amei Ha'aretz? Remember, Acherim, the halacha follows Acherim. Rav Huna says halacha ka'acherim. The Dordeya of the Midbar, they are the key to the transmission of Torah. A transmission of Torah that's lacking Shimush Talmidei Chachamim is not ideal. Are we to imagine that our Torah, as it has been given over to us, is all predicated on a non-ideal transmission of Torah? Is that not a frightening thought? This Nakuda, this point, that Klal Yisrael had never had the opportunity to be Mishamish Talmidei Chachamim, this is what Moshe Rabbeinu was going to fix with Sefer Devarim. Having a Sefer which is predicated on Shinun and Dibur is somehow or another going to allow for this flaw to be rectified. That there will be a Shimush Talmidei Chachamim. That's why Moshe Rabbeinu needed a Sefer that is given over the way Abai puts it, as explained by the Goyen, that Moshe Mipi Atzmei Amra. Now let's explain. Imagine the following scenario. I'm going to give you an analogy. You have a guy, he's top in his class. I'm talking top in his class. And he has studied everything there is to study. The guy has gone through medical school and he has learned every word in the book, backwards, forwards, upside down. He also read every book that was ever printed on surgery and he could repeat it to you verbatim. The guy's a genius. I know people like that. Okay, you come into the hospital and Nebuch, you need a surgery. So they say, here's the guy. He knows everything there is to know about surgery. So did he ever do a surgery? No, he's never done surgery, but who cares? He's read every book on the planet. He knows everything there is to know about everything. So what do you mean? He didn't do a surgical residency? No. Why does he need to do a surgical residency? He knows it all. Korah, V'Shana, he knows the Torah B'Ksav and the Torah B'Al Peh of surgery. Not a problem. And he's top in his class. So you want him to do surgery? So you'd say, no, I don't want him to do surgery. So why not? I'll tell you why not. Because he's an Amoritz. So what do you mean he's an Amoritz? He knows everything there is to know. Yeah, thank you. He might know everything there is to know, but he's still an Amoritz. when it comes to the doing of surgery. The man's an Am Haaretz. Doesn't matter how much he knows, he's an Am Haaretz. But if he studied under the master surgeon and did a residency in surgery and observed how it's done, now he becomes a very sought after surgeon. What's the difference? Where's the point of difference? The point is very simple. There is the information of any body, right? What we call the body of information on any subject. And then there is the reality of that subject. Kara Vishana is merely the mechanics by which you get the body of information, but you don't have any access to the reality of that information. He could read as many books as he wants on surgery, and he has the body of information, but without having done the shimush in surgery, he has no access to the reality of surgery. He's an Am Haaretz. The same holds true for Torah. You could have all the body of information, but if you don't have shimush talmidei chachamim, you don't have access to the reality of that information. It would be the same as having this A student do surgery on you without ever having done shimush under the master. No one in their right mind would ever agree to that. Why? Because he's an Am Haaretz. The same holds true for Torah. If he hasn't done residency under the master, sure, he might know everything there is to know, but he has no access to the reality of it. And Torah is even more than what it takes to be a good surgeon. Torah is made up of so many different facets, you could even use the word infinite when we're talking about Torah. And so what's going to coalesce all of that? All of the different elements that have to go into one picture that creates Torah. What's going to coalesce that? What's going to make that all become a single picture? What's going to give you access into the reality of Torah, as opposed to just the body of information of Torah? The answer is Shimush Talmidei Chachamim. Because that's what Shimush Talmidei Chachamim allows you to do. You're not merely receiving the information from the master, you're also receiving the access to the reality of that information. And without accessing that, you remain a total and utter Am Haaretz, in exactly the same way that that student would remain a total and utter Am Haaretz no matter how much he knows, because he's never accessed the reality of it. That's the point of Shimush Talmidei Chachamim. Shimush Talmidei Chachamim is accomplished not by taking from the information that the Rebbe knows. Shimush Talmidei Chachamim is accomplished by living the life that that information bestows. That's Shimush Talmidei Chachamim, where you live your life together with the Chacham and see how to access the reality of that information. Not merely to know it. You have to somehow be able to be given entry into the world of the Chacham, to live his actual world with him, so as to be able to coalesce all the information and make it something which is accessible from a reality point of view. How it is in real, not how it is in information, but how it is in the real. And in order to do that, you need to study not under his tutelage of information, but under his tutelage of life, the living of that information. Just like the surgical student needs to not only learn the information from his master, but how to live the life of surgery. That's what Shimush Talmidei Chachamim gives you. And so the difference between Karav Deshana and Shimush Talmidei Chachamim can be described perhaps using slightly different terms. Kara Vishana is entirely an external exercise. While as Shimush Talmidei Chachamim is an internal exercise. And that difference is the difference between an Am Ha'aretz and a Talmid Chacham. Not the information, but your ability to access the actual real time, real life of that information, which without a Shimush Talmidei Chachamim becomes a virtual impossibility. Memela says Rav Huna, halacha ka'achirim. The halacha is indeed like achir, as we all see experientially. The halacha is indeed like achir. Kol zman, as long as Moshe Rabbeinu is still in his state of nevuah, while repeating the Peh El Peh, no one has access to Moshe Rabbeinu the person. Because there is no person, there is merely the Beire's word being transmitted from this person. By receiving the nevuah and then sharing it when not in a state of nevuah, Moshe Rabbeinu now has something that he's never had before. He has what I like to call editorial liberty. Not editorial license, because it's Peh El Peh, and it will be verbatim. But editorial liberty. And what does that mean, liberty? Oh, well, liberty means that he has liberty in terms of the order, in terms of the form. He can be angry when he needs to be angry. He can be soft when he needs to be soft. He can repeat when it needs to be repeated. He can convolute when it needs to be convoluted. You know what we call that liberty? Again, let's go through what liberty gives him. He can speak as he needs. He can speak harshly. He could speak softly. He could speak convoluted. He could speak using repetition. Repetitiously. You know what that's called? Shinun v'dibur. That's what it's called. Shinun v'dibur. And Shinun v'dibur allows us access not to the information alone, but Shinun v'dibur gives us access into the person of Moshe Rabbeinu. And so we ask, why did Moshe Rabbeinu need a Sefer Eila HaDvarim, which, as we explained, is referred to as Mishnah Torah and Sefer Devarim, and according to Rashi, that means simply Shinun v'dibur? The answer is what Moshe Rabbeinu gains by a Sefer of Shinun v'dibur is that now all of Klal Yisrael has had the opportunity for Shimush Talmidei Chachamim. For this information is not external information. This information is living the life together with Moshe Rabbeinu, what we call the Shimush Talmidei Chachamim. And so indeed, a Sefer Devarim now becomes a prerequisite for a proper transmission of that Torah that was given to the Dor Deya. For without it, they would have remained Amei Ha'aretz. Says Abaye, Eila Hadvarim Asher Diber Moshe, Moshe mipi atzmai omrei. What does that mean? It doesn't mean from his own mouth. It means Moshe speaking as himself, he said. It's the P of atzmai, giving access to the atzmai of Moshe Rabbeinu. Shimush Talmidei Chachamim. Not external, internal. Giving them access not only to the information, but to the reality of that information. And that can only come through Shinun v'dibur. Memela Sefer Devarim is not only one of our Sfarim, it is the key to the ability for Torah to be transmitted in the most ideal fashion. This Sefer Indeed, it is different than all the other four Sfarim, which is why it is its own Sefer. Its mode of transmission is fundamentally different than all the others. And its mode of transmission is the mode of Shimush Talmidei Chachamim, which is what allows our Torah to be transmitted not by Amei Haaretz, but by people who are indeed capable of transmitting Torah in its most ideal form. This is the point of Sefer Devarim. Okay. Are there any questions? Wait, I'm unmuting you. Is everybody unmuted? Yes, yeah. We're all unmuted. Very good. Are there any questions?
I'm good.
Okay. It was a pleasure seeing you all. We shall reconvene.
Rebbe.
Who's talking?
Aaron Lippman.
Yes, Aaron.
Does the shimush need to be on every detail of the external knowledge, or is it the?
It's not. I don't mean when I say external. I don't mean external knowledge.
Well, just as opposed to the what the shimush conveys.
Yeah. So shimush. Say again. What are you asking?
Does the shimush need to be about the person with the Rebbe as the person, or with the Rebbe as the information? I'm not.
You have to be with the Rebbe as the person so that you see how the reality of Torah is, as opposed to just the information of how Torah is.
Okay. So if I wouldn't see him, let's say, doing a specific mitzvah, could I still be considered a Talmid Chacham in regards to that mitzvah, since I was Mashamish the Rebbe?
In regards to a single mitzvah?
Yeah.
I guess.
But I would need to be Mashamish the totality of the Rebbe in order to remove the status of Amaretz.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Rebbe, is that also, can someone say also that Yoshua was an extension of that Shinan and Dibur of those things that were already said verbatim then?
No, not all of Yoshua, only very specific parts of Yoshua.
The last 8 psukim that were
Dani, you're doing it again. Where is he? You're doing it again.
No, I just the Shinan and Dibur part of it. It's exactly those things that were already said verbatim, but now it's the same way that Moshe is doing it, Yoshua is doing it. So now it makes sense.
Okay. I'm not going into the Yoshua thing. You and I have had this Yoshua Moshe Rabbeinu thing going for how many years now?
I think 4 or 5.
Yeah. All right,
Thank
you guys. A pleasure. I'll see you all.
All right, Rebbe.
Thank you, Rebbe.